Let's go on to the next item.
Thank you very much.
Which is a presentation on the geographic goals.
Yes, and we have our consultants from ashb Robinson who are here to help, and I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Ms. Truelove. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Miller with ashb Robinson, and we are the prime consultant to the Neighborhood Housing Community Development Department on the Austin Strategic Housing Blueprint Implementation Plan, which included the establishment of the geographic goals we're going to talk to you about today.
Hi, my name is Marla Torrado, and I'm with the Austin Community Design and Development Center, and we are sub-consultants working also with ashb Robinson on this project.
Great. So with that, I'm going to dive right in. There's the clicker. Great. Quick agenda for what we're going to talk about today, give a little bit of background on the project, since I know that not everyone here was here when we presented, I believe, last August or September. Then really dive deep into the methodology, how we came to some of the numbers for setting council district goals and corridor goals for affordable housing production and preservation. And then we'll have a good time for questions, but also I think like the last presentation, just let me know and we'll go through it as you have questions. So the basis for this effort that we underwent was based on council resolutions that really did ask that we have that NHCD established specific numeric housing goals and strategies based on the adopted strategic housing blueprint. And so really establishing some numbers that could generate some ongoing monitoring and accountability that could fit in with, I believe, the strategic direction and other things that the council is working on to monitor affordable housing production efforts specifically, as well as preservation efforts. So there were three components to what we worked on, and we're primarily going to be talking about the second and third ones today, the Atlas of Existing and Historical Conditions, which is really the basis for a lot of these geographic goals that we've established, as well as the corridor analysis that ACDDC led, that is mostly the basis for the corridor-specific goals. So a quick overview of the Atlas. It has three main components. It has an opportunity index, which defines metrics of opportunity. What we did was we used, and I'll get further into this as we go through, but we used a public database established by a group called Enterprise Community Partners who work on affordable housing issues nationally, called Opportunity 360. And this database takes into account a wide variety of metrics of opportunity and is updated annually. So the great thing about this data source is that the city can continue to update measures of opportunity as situations change and as the city changes without having to redo the analysis essentially themselves. So we use that tool to go ahead and create an operational definition of high opportunity areas, which was a concept that was mentioned in the blueprint but had not yet been established in terms of what does that mean in terms of geography on the ground. The second piece of the Atlas is the Displacement Risk Index. And so we corresponded with the University of Texas, who had been conducting a gentrification study for the city. And they had done some really detailed work on displacement risk and on gentrification and sort of where ongoing displacement is happening, as well as where future vulnerable areas are to potential displacement. And so we used that to establish our Displacement Risk Index. And then finally, we also did an environmental index. And this is largely areas of environmental risk where we either think that affordable housing should not be located, such as in the 100-year floodplain, or should really require additional due diligence. Say, near a freeway, we should do some testing for air quality before you build affordable housing in a particular location.
Would you like us to ask questions now?
Please.
Yes, please.
Okay, just two questions. On the environmental index, on the floodplains, did you use the Atlas 14?
We did not, because it was not yet available at the time. We mostly completed the analysis last year, and so it hadn't yet come out. But I would say that this is not necessarily it is not as relevant, I think, to the council district goals in terms of having been incorporated into those. It's more kind of a separate layer for kind of locating specific projects. But I would say that using the Atlas 14 and updating this to the Atlas 14 would be ideal in the future.
Yeah, and I actually think I understand what you're saying, but I actually think it is relevant because you know, at the end of the day, this is a higher level look at goals, which is important. But at the end of the day, we're going to be looking at tracking the ability to reach goals,
Right.
which is going to require us to get down to specific properties. And so I think we need to start at a realistic level, or at least understand that we will have to adjust. I don't know how much, but there are. It depends on the part of the city. But there are parts of city where there is significant additional risk from Atlas 14. So I would just ask as a takeaway, and maybe this is for our staff, I'm not sure, but as a takeaway, just so that we can understand what might be the timeline for updating. We know that our staff, watershed staff, is updating the maps, but they do have an idea already of where some of these areas are. So there might be the possibility, it will take them some time to update the maps, but there may be some possibility of updating this as an interim measure. And so as a takeaway, I'd just like to understand what's possible. So then my second question is just on the opportunity index. Two questions. Can you, what document can I look at if I want to dive in and understand the metrics in the opportunity index better?
Absolutely.
I know it's out there. I'm just not sure where to look.
Yeah, so this would be that atlas of existing and historical conditions that we created as one of the parts of this contract, and that has all of the different metrics explained in there, including individual maps for the different. It has about 9 indices that they establish, and it goes through the components of those 9 indices, and it has maps of each.
I remember that we talked about this before. I just need a refresher. Can you just give me? So I'm assuming that's available on our website somewhere. Maybe someone can point it to me. So I'll look to staff to point to where it is. And then the last question is, can you just give us an example or two so I can? And also, would you say that data is updated, or are there things happening that need to update that particular data that's akin to what I just said on the Atlas 14?
I would say that data, actually, the idea is that there would be ongoing updates because enterprise community partners. So this is last year's, and so I would say that there does need to be a process for updating this. I don't know that it has to be annual because a lot of these metrics don't necessarily move very far on an annual basis on average. But I do know that, there are a lot of areas that are changing rapidly, and so it certainly would be useful to update it. And I think that is in the plans to continue to update this, which is why we use that data source.
And is there anything that's inherent in the opportunity index where the data is, 5 years old or more?
No, I don't believe so.
So it's relatively recent data. Okay.
Also, I'm sorry, Mandy DeMayo, Neighborhood Housing Community Development. With respect to the Atlas of Historical Conditions, it is on our webpage. If you go to austintexas.gov/housing, it's actually on the front. This is for the public in general as well. Front, if you just click on the Strategic Housing Blueprint, it will take you to all of those documents, so you'll be able to delve into them.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So with that, the real objective here is to get kind of into the weeds on these goals and how we establish them, because I know that there is an interest in really understanding and being able to say whether or not this is the appropriate methodology for establishing district-level goals for housing production and preservation. So that is what we are doing, and so please do let me know if if I'm not being basically clear, because I think there's a lot of just like really detailed methodology that we're doing our best to explain, but if there's something that comes up and it's just unclear, absolutely let me know and we'll go into it. So generally the citywide housing goals, these are the goals established by the Strategic Housing Blueprint, which include, so there's a 135,000 unit number, I believe, that is like the full production goal. Of that, we are looking to do 60,000 affordable units below 80% MFI in the next 10 years, according to the Strategic Housing Blueprint. And so we have focused throughout this presentation on that 60,000 number. Given that the city has different tools and that NHCD's tools are really focused on, as Ms. Trulove mentioned, those below 80% MFI folks, we are really focused on sort of how and where to add those units in this presentation. So for these sort of market rate and higher income units, the thought is that there are other tools we can use to influence where those go, but they wouldn't necessarily include affordable housing tools. So the blueprint identifies a number of geographic metrics that we looked at in terms of understanding how to better allocate these units across council districts, including that high opportunity sort of metrics that we talked about earlier. Quarter mile of high frequency transit was one of the ideas mentioned, and then also within 1/2 mile of Imagine Austin centers and corridors is another geographic concept that comes up in the strategic housing blueprint. And so this, in a nutshell, is the table of goals. I know the type is kind of small, but these are the goals that we have established as an overview before we get into the details on each of these sort of different policy objectives. So generally what we did was we took some of those geographic policy objectives that are identified in the blueprint, so including locating units in high opportunity areas, locating units in Imagine Austin centers and corridors or nearby, locating units near high frequency transit. To that, based on feedback that we got on the draft and based on other sort of ongoing planning efforts that involved housing, we added gentrifying areas as a specific focus because we know that this displacement mitigation, as we talked about, is a huge policy objective of the city of Austin that is, one of the key ideas in the strategic housing blueprint as well, and certainly has geographic implications that University of Texas did, work to establish in terms of where are those gentrifying areas actually, and where do we see them in the city. And then finally, another addition to the methodology based on feedback, and again, this has its basis in the blueprint and in public comment that we received, was geographic dispersion of affordable housing generally. So this is the fair housing idea that you don't want to concentrate poverty, you want to make sure that there is access to affordable housing across the entire city, and so making sure that each council district has kind of a share of units and that we are really looking to locate those across the city rather than concentrate them in one particular area. So these 4 policy objectives, the high opportunity, the Imagine Austin, and high frequency transit, which did get combined. So I want that happened after the last sort of round of comments, that those two came together because we saw them really as saying, how do we concentrate, sort of people near resources like transit and jobs and things like that. Then we had gentrifying areas as a 3rd policy objective and geographic dispersion as a 4th. Each of those we've allocated basically an equal share of those 60,000 units. So we've weighted them equally and said we are going to use sort of those policy objectives and their geographic implications to distribute units across the city and see where we come out. And so the numbers that you see on this council district goal slide are the summary of where that led us to date.
And I am going to have to hand the chair over to Vice Chair Ellis here in a little while.
Okay.
But so I wanted to make sort of my point. Now, if you look at at what is at the high frequency transit and Imagine Austin corridors and centers numbers, one issue or challenge that I have is that districts 4, 5, and 9 seem to actually have a relatively lower level allocation there than places like districts 1, 2, or 6. And I think that in part the high opportunity area designation and the geographic dispersion items, those things are really important, but generally areas that have more space get more weights because they take up more space, which has just a slight skew towards affordable housing being built further out on the edge of the city. So part of the hope with the high frequency transit was to sort of try to correct for that somewhat by trying to concentrate some more into what are smaller districts that have more high frequency transit. But when you look at the allocation for high frequency transit for District 9, for example, being 1,000 and for District 1 being close to 3,000, oftentimes, when you think of the city generally, District 9 has much more access to lots more routes than, say, certain parts of District 1, or that District 4's number is almost the same as District 8's. Generally, District 4 has a lot more access to a lot more routes being smaller and closer to the middle of the city than, say, District 8. And so it seems a little bit counterintuitive there. And so my hope, and I think in part it's because that happened when we combined high-frequency transit with Imagine Austin centers and corridors, because a center that is out at Lakeline Station or a center at Breaker and Dessau is large, but isn't quite the same when it comes to high-frequency transit and connectivity and services as, say, the downtown center or the Highland Mall Center or other centers like that. So I just think that there is and I'm happy to hear the discussion, but it just seems like 4, 5, and 9, which kind of compose some parts of, and some western portions of 3, for example, that really compose that central spine of our transit service going north-south, just have a lower number here than I think makes intuitive sense to me. I don't know if you have got comments on that.
Yeah, I have comments or questions, actually, and I'm sorry I stepped out for a minute, so I may have missed the first part. So did you ask, I mean, is this based on future transit or current transit?
This is based on I believe, I can't remember the exact name of the plan, but I think it's Connections 2025. So it is based on the routes that are planned.
So it's not the future, it's not Project Connect, which is it's Cap Remap, which is the bus route, not Project Connect. Okay, because that will make a difference.
Yep.
And I think that we should talk about how and if it's possible to base this on. Of course, that's years out, and so you have to consider the timeline too, because Project Connect is a vision at the moment. It's not actual, but it would make a difference, a big difference. The other thing to remember is that actually we can talk about, we need to dig down into the details. Unfortunately, District 5 is not the core of the transit system. I wish it was, but it isn't. So, we can talk about that more, but you would think it would be with it being central south, but it's not. There's actually, there are things that are planned for District 5 in the future, for example, down Manchac, which is the major spine of District 5, but we don't have it yet. We don't even have the 803 going down Manchac yet. So really all we have is what you see down South Lamar. And so in terms of east and west, there's a lot more that needs to happen. So I just want to be careful that we just don't assume that some of these districts, because of where they are in the city, have what they need to get to. So
Absolutely, and I think we all lack quite the level of transit service that we want. It's just generally looking at, some parts of district. I think that ultimately, because you have in places like District 1, a larger land area and larger centers, I think that there is just...
It's really the length of the corridor.
Since it's based on the length of the corridor and you have a more expansive district, sometimes on districts that are more on the edge, I think there is a bit of a skew towards that. In the numbers when I look at them, just because basically the bigger the geographic district,
right?
The higher the numbers are.
The more would you want that to be the case?
I think not, because that has I think that has a slight skew towards putting more affordable housing just based on the size of your district, which has to do oftentimes with how much of your district touches the edge of the city. So typically our larger geographic districts, city council districts, get bigger as they get closer to the edge, because our political boundaries are drawn by population. And so where you have lower population density, you have larger bulges in our districts. As you see at the edge of each of our city council districts tends to get bigger closer to the edge. And so I think that is fine. On the one hand, that might mean there's more room for more affordable housing. On the other hand, since we want more affordable housing to be infilled into existing neighborhoods to promote integration and connection to services, I think we're just trying to balance that. And if you look at the old numbers that were first presented to us, for example, District 4 under when we looked at just high-frequency transit, without combining it with Imagine Austin centers and corridors, was looking more like 1,600 units in this category, whereas now you're looking at more 1,000. District 9, when you were just looking at transit, in the old plan that was presented to us, you're talking about 4,000 units dedicated to transit, whereas here you're talking about 1,000. So it's just by combining Imagine Austin centers and corridors with transit, there's been a bit of a diluting of the importance of transit. And I think given the level of transit investment that we're thinking about making, it's an important. I think that we just are getting a little bit less of an infill affordable housing goal and a little bit more on the edge.
Well, I would just, I'd like to dig into what the weighting is, because that may be part of the issue, is the weighting. And so from a policy perspective, we've said that we want housing all over the city, so that we make sure that we have housing all over the city, and especially in high opportunity areas. So if I'm hearing you, that's one of the concerns, is that perhaps we aren't getting to that policy. Is that what you're saying?
I think that concern was our concern last time we saw this, and they reconfigured some of the criteria in a way that I think that has addressed that pretty well.
Okay.
I think through that process, a little bit of our transit's priority has been lost a little bit. So I'm just talking about figuring out if there are small modifications to be made to make sure that where you've got 2 or 3 transit lines, or where you have transit every 10 minutes, that we try to prioritize that a little bit more. Just because I think we lost some of that in this process. Not to overturn the whole apple cart here, I think you're really close. But for me, I think that a transit line that is really long and runs all the way to the edge and runs less frequently, in some ways gets some priority here, in ways that I want to make sure that we calibrate it so that if you've got really frequent transit, really close to the middle of the city, that we really try to also prioritize that too.
Okay, well, here's what I would say to that. I agree that that it's important that the transit be a priority, but I think that that requires us doing a couple of things. It requires us looking at the future plans for transit, because that really is more relevant than what's on the ground right now. The other thing I think it requires us to remember is that I would have to say that I would just suggest to not assume that the longer lines that go further out actually are going to be less frequent. Because if you look at the orange line under Project Connect, that's scheduled to go all the way down to Slaughter. So I think what's really important for us is not to, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but is to remember that the transit is for the whole city, which means not just the center of the city. And so that means that we really need to look at our housing opportunities, and not just affordable housing, but our housing opportunities along all those lines, and not just part of them, and not just the part that's closer to downtown, particularly with the activity centers, because part of the idea around the activity centers is to get us to be a city where not everybody has to go downtown to work. And we're seeing some of that happen up north, and we're hoping to get more towards that in the south. But so I would just say I think it's worth looking at again, and looking at from the perspective of the future plans for transit. But then let's remember that I think at this point in time we can't say one way or the other whether this means that we need more numbers here or there. But we do need to go back and look at it.
I don't think we disagree. I'm just looking at districts 1 and 2 getting the most sort of transit affordable housing. Just seems intuitively, again, generally not like the places that are served by far the most, especially sometimes by almost 3x, if that makes sense.
And are you looking at this one as opposed to the corridor? You're looking at
I'm looking at the district goals.
Not the corridor goals, right?
The district goals as they relate to high-frequency transit and
okay, but not the corridor goals. In some ways, the corridor goals are the easiest to relate to transit.
And if you look up on the web, the corridor goals all have the numbers. You know, it's all the major streets have a goal of building, you know, affordable housing at 80% MFI and below.
Okay.
That's the goal that's on all the major corridors.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So also, it's going to affect the numbers on whatever district.
Yeah.
They're really going to be concentrating on the corridors, because it's going to. I mean, the numbers are going to change, because, I mean, I have like. Our goal here in East Riverside Drive is to have 1,144 affordable units on Riverside.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a lot more development going on. But that's the goal that we have on that corridor.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to have to step out, but I think that...
I didn't mean to sidetrack you.
No, you didn't sidetrack us all. That was a good conversation. I'm going to hand the chair over to Vice Chair Ellis, and I think that if you provide us what those options might look like for weighting, I think very likely you can find the sweet spot that everybody agrees on. But I think it's very close.
Well, and just one related question. So how do the council district goals relate to the corridor goals? I mean, are they they're cumulative, right? We look at both together, or are they overlapping?
I would say that they are. You look at both together because they all need to. Generally they all fit into that achievement of the 60,000 affordable housing production and preservation.
So you
goal.
add them. You add the corridor goals and the council district goals to get to the 60,000.
No, sorry. They are overlapping. They overlap with one another.
Okay, all right. That's what I was trying to understand.
This would be, as you build these corridor goals, as you build things along these corridors, you will also be achieving council district goals. You will be working toward both.
Okay, so, okay, all right. So it's almost like the corridor goals are a subset.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
It's a more specific geographic
Okay.
subset.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to get now into some of the more detailed methodology, if that works for everybody. So generally, one of the asks that we got on the following slide here was to ensure. So a lot of our variables are area-based, right? Which is what Councilmember Kassar was referring to when he said, it depends on where you have. Sometimes when you have a smaller council district, you just have less area where you can actually build affordable housing, and we wanted to factor that in because we know that there are constraints that actually occur when you have districts that are largely built out, that have smaller area. And while we want to make sure that we are building housing in the center of the city, we also want to make sure that we are creating goals that are feasible as much as possible. So one of the feasibility pieces that was requested at the last meeting that we presented at was to make sure that we are subtracting out areas that are dedicated to parkland, conservation land, basically anything that is unbuildable in the different council districts from our kind of area calculation. So if you had a park within a quarter mile of transit, we are now not assuming that you can actually build on that park, essentially. So that applies across the board for all of the area-based variables, which include high opportunity, Imagine Austin, transit, and gentrifying areas. So for the high opportunity areas, the detail on the methodology is here on the slide. Generally what we did was, the first thing we had to do was we had Opportunity 360 data that was indexed at a regional level. We essentially re-indexed it so that it is, and what you essentially get is a value between, say, 1 and 10, let's say, for each census tract in the region. And so and that is based on kind of regional averages. So what we had to do first was re-average that data so that it incorporated only the tracts that are within the city of Austin, which we did. There are 9 total sort of indices that Councilmember Kitchen was referring to earlier that comprise the Opportunity 360 data. So we created 9 tables that essentially gave each census tract a value of 0 or 1, depending on whether it was above or below the median value for each of the 9 different sort of indices that Opportunity 360 uses. So we just are saying, if you're a tract, are you above the median for education, or are you below? Are you above the median for access to jobs, or are you below? And so for each tract, we then summed up those numbers, and so each tract ended up with a value between 0 and 9, essentially, right? Because you either got a 1 value if you're above the median or a 0 value if you're below. And we define high opportunity as tracts that had a 6 or more. So essentially on 6 of the total indices that are in Opportunity 360, these tracts are above the median. And we felt like that was a pretty fair characterization. We did add one, so on the map that you have there, the sort of lighter areas are areas that have 5 or more, because we felt like it was also important to identify the emerging opportunity areas in the city. However, those have not been included as high opportunity for the purposes of our calculations. They're just kind of showing where you can probably expect to see future high opportunity areas emerge. So that was how the high opportunity areas were ultimately identified. Does anyone have a question on that? And again, those 9 indices, you can see the more detailed maps in the atlas if you want to go look at those.
And did you have a question?
No, I'm good. I'm
Great.
sorry.
Just checking.
All right. So then for the high frequency transit or Imagine Austin centers and corridors. So again, we use this to allocate, and I should have mentioned, so we used for each of these variables that I'm mentioning. So for high opportunity areas, the reason it says 25% is because we use this calculation to allocate 25% or 15,000 of the total 60,000 units across the city. So we basically have chopped that 60,000 into fourths and are allocating it geographically in different ways based on each of these kind of policy priorities. And so this was the first. The second one that we used to allocate the next chunk of 15,000 units was this merged high-frequency transit and Imagine Austin centers and corridors variable that we were just discussing, which includes a buffer of a 1/4 mile around all high-frequency transit lines. And I will say that I think we may have actually used some of the future planning areas as well in this. We received a file from Cap Metro that I think did perhaps include some of the Project Connect planning. So we're going to go back and just make sure that of what we are including here and be able to come back and tell you all which routes are included here. But generally, high frequency, I believe, is defined as all routes that are 15-minute headways or less. And we used a buffer of a 1/4 mile around those routes. We also used a buffer of a 1/2 mile around Imagine Austin centers and corridors. And that the difference there was actually defined in the strategic housing blueprint. Those are kind of the geographies that are called for in the blueprint. So we stuck with those. And then we merged those two data sets. And so essentially this allocation defines basically all of these geographies become the same for the purposes of this analysis. It's just one big sort of buffer file that has all of the Imagine Austin centers and corridors within a 1/2 mile, all of the high frequency transit within a 1/2 mile. It's just all one big layer, and we use that to allocate percentages of these 15,000 units across all of the districts. For gentrifying areas, so this is the next chunk of 15,000 units that we allocated, we used the final data from the University of Texas gentrification study, and essentially the thing that we did not include was any area that was identified as sort of vulnerable in the University of Texas study. So there are areas that have said that basically University of Texas is categorized as like, we think these might be the next areas that start gentrifying, but they haven't yet. We did not include those in our gentrifying areas. We only used the areas that UT identified as actively gentrifying now, but in any stage. So whether that's very early through continued loss.
So, could I ask a question? So help me understand why you didn't include the vulnerable areas. Because when that would be a factor that we would want to consider in some way in terms of, and particularly since we're trying to get ahead of the concerns about gentrification. Mm-hmm. If we're coming back after the fact, then that makes it more difficult.
So I think there's certainly an opportunity to include those. I think we felt that the sort of preservation, the early gentrifying areas, there are still a fair number of those, and that sort of focusing preservation efforts there rather than areas that haven't yet started might be more productive. But generally, and that, if the idea is like, so I think generally the policy objective we had was like mitigate sort of displacement that is happening. And so these were places where displacement was happening. But I agree that, it's possible that the vulnerable areas might, we certainly would want to think about adding those in potentially future years as we see that displacement starts happening there.
Well, I would just say from a policy matter, I would certainly put greater priority on the areas that are already gentrifying and the difficulties there. I would certainly say that that's important. But part of what we're trying to do across all of the things that we're doing, affordability and housing and land development codes and everything we're trying to do is to look to the future instead of coming back behind. And so we're growing so fast. I think that I really would like to flag that from a policy standpoint. And I'm curious if there's some way to look at the vulnerable areas and weight them in a way that doesn't give them as much weight as the areas that already are a problem. But also, they should be weighted more than other parts of the city that are not at risk for gentrification. Otherwise, I think we're losing the opportunity to get ahead of problems. We're also could inadvertently be targeting areas in a way that is not helpful and could actually be harmful and speed up gentrification. So I'd like to make a note of that. I'd like to ask y'all, if you were to do that, how would you do it? So, or ask staff to take that away as something to consider.
Or maybe if somehow some of those numbers have been factored into the district goals as you broke them down into 4 different categories.
Yeah, they might be. They might be.
They might be. I noticed there were a couple districts that didn't have, they had a 0 for gentrifying, but they had quite high numbers for other areas.
Right.
Because people are still being displaced, based on income rather than other factors.
So that might really be the question. How would you account for it? Maybe it's not waiting. Maybe there's some other way, or maybe it has been.
Yeah.
Or it's, picked up somewhere in these numbers that could benefit from just being highlighted a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm talking about the
On where that is.
vulnerable areas.
Right.
You know.
And I think we certainly could. I think what you'll see is it'll be a fairly, I mean, again, we will look at it. I think it'll be a fairly small tweak in comparison to the sort of overall need for sort of in terms of like the overall, the way that it will actually affect the final numbers.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm really not as focused on the final numbers. I'm kind of thinking about what we then do with this
Right.
afterwards
Right.
in terms of where we target our investments as a city to get to the 60,000 number.
Yeah. And we do have in the atlas, in terms of geographic sort of targeting, those vulnerable areas are identified and shown. And so actually, if we go back and look at the displacement risk map here,
Okay.
it's those lighter areas in light brown
Okay.
that are the vulnerable areas versus the darker areas in dark brown that are the areas where displacement is actively happening, according
Okay.
to the UT study. So it does make a fairly, like in terms of the geographic difference, it's sort of a larger area. And I would say that it still is definitely possible to think about how one might target resources toward like future mitigation in those areas without necessarily, while still sort of having the goals focus right now in terms of that component of them on the sort of active areas that are current where displacement is happening.
Yeah, I guess I'm just getting, I think of it more from a bottom up, kind of adding up to these numbers. And I know the numbers are not hard and fast.
Right.
I mean, these are targets.
Yeah.
But really, you've got to think about where we can actually really put housing on the ground. And if we're not accounting for factors where we wouldn't want to do it, just like the issues that we had with the dedicated parkland and stuff like that, it's the same kind of problem.
Right.
So, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the last variable that we used to allocate the final chunk of 15,000 units was geographic dispersion of subsidized housing. And I believe that, again, this was based on sort of coordinating with the concurrent analysis of impediments that is going on at a regional level right now, making sure that we are factoring in fair housing concerns as we do this work. And so the idea that we really don't want to be concentrating affordable housing all in one part of the city. We want to make sure that there are opportunities across the city, as we talked about. So this probably has the sort of most complex methodology, although it ends up being pretty simple once I get through it. So bear with me for a second. We took the existing affordable units in each district as provided by NHCD. So basically the existing affordable units that we know currently exist, as well as some of the existing market rate affordable units, I believe, in each district. We added that total with, this says 60,000, actually with the 15,000 chunk of the 16,000 affordable units. So say we had about 37,000 existing affordable units. We added the 15,000 chunk that we are allocating based on this metric to that. So we said, okay, so here's your total of about 50,000 units that you have, where we want to make sure these are as geographically dispersed as possible. We then said, okay, well, in that case, each of Austin's 10 council districts should have about a tenth if we were trying to spread them out equally. And so the goal would be about almost 5,000 units per district, that each district would end up with about that number. And so then we compared that to, okay, what is the existing? And we found that districts 1, 2, and 3 actually already exceed those goals. So they would not get any new units under this particular variable. The other districts, we ended up with about 19,000 additional units that we needed in order to get there. We only have about 15 to allocate according to this metric. So we then said, for each district, what percentage of the shortage is actually being the result of the number of affordable units in each district? So District 1, 2, and 3 are already good. Districts 4 through 10, what percentage of the shortage is coming from each of those districts? And we then used those percentages to allocate the 15,000 total units we had within this metric across each of the districts. And so that is where the geographic dispersion numbers, which are, we can see back on this slide, that's where those numbers for each district came from, is it's sort of taking the percentage of the shortage that is accounted for in each district and saying you should get that percentage of these 15,000 units that we have to allocate. So comparatively, you can see that, for example, District 6 and 10 had a large, and 8 had a larger percentage of the shortage so far than Districts, 7 or say 9. So that was the last chunk. Any questions? So we're going to get into the corridor goals now, but any remaining questions on the council district goals?
Sorry, just a quick, I'll just go on the details, but the affordable units, is that, are we consider, what went into that for purposes of that last calculation? Was it just the public ones, or did you go broader than that in terms of the?
Yeah, so I believe this is all units affordable at 80% MFI.
Okay. Public or private?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, let's continue.
All right, corridor goals. I'm going to hand this over to Marla.
Yeah. So for the corridor goals, we basically had like a two-step process. The first one, we were tasked to look into the corridor housing preservation tool that the University of Texas had developed a few years ago. And basically this tool was developed having in mind areas that are rapidly changing and rapidly are under pressure of development and gentrification. So it's intended to look into how affordable housing play with other important aspects of a rapidly changing city, including transportation, economic development, and also just general housing. And so it also provides a way to analyze the stock of affordable housing and how we can make sure that we help preserve in areas that it might be vulnerable. So if you go to the next slide. So basically the tool looks into answers three main questions and has specific indices to calculate each of these questions. So the first one, it asks how much transit access to jobs does a corridor provide to low-income residents? So looking at the amount of low and medium wage jobs that are in each corridor that can be accessed through a 45-minute transit access. And so the second question that it looks into, and the second index, is how many affordable rental units are vulnerable to redevelopment. So basically looking at both private and public housing units that are affordable for 80% median family income or below, that could be redeveloped in the next 10 years, basically. And then the last one is how intense is the development pressure in the corridor. So looking at the multifamily rental units that could be ripe for redevelopment in the next 5 years, and also using the development pressure that is happening in that corridor again, in that specific corridor. It's how you calculate kind of that intensity of development pressure for that specific index. So basically, by looking at these questions, it can help cities and staff to look into different, what are the different criteria or different tools that can be used depending on how these three different indices work together. So a little bit of information on where the data comes from. There's a lot of census data that goes into this tool. EPA Smart Location Database, a lot of housing databases. So basically the point here to make is that this is readily available data that is out there. So it's very easy for this tool to just be updated every so often whenever the staff requires it. And so as city changes and needs change, this can be easily updated. So basically what this tool provides is kind of a vision of a bar graph of how these three different indicators work together. So access to transit, vulnerability of affordable housing, and then the development pressure. And again, like I said, this part of the corridor goal is like a two-step process where this first one, we kind of look at the overall, what is happening, what are the things that can be affecting affordable housing in these specific corridors. So, for example, if you have an area that has a high development pressure, that might also mean that the land value is pretty high. So maybe there might be some preservation tools that might be taken into consideration there. Whereas areas that the development pressure might be low, you might be thinking about land banking could be a potential good option. So this information kind of gives an overall broad perspective of how, again, transportation, development pressure, and vulnerable housing play together in each corridor that then will be used for actually having the final numbers, which are next.
All right. Turn that back on. So the final, so we essentially, so as Marla mentioned, what you end up with at the end of this work is, oh, sorry, go ahead. Let's remember.
Anne?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So the availability of, maybe this is in the development pressure. So the availability of tracks to put housing on, is that factored in here somewhere? I mean, where would that come in?
Can you repeat the question again?
Well, I'm trying to think of how to, we have to look at, if our goal is X number of units, is embedded in one of these measures what's available?
Which tracts would be available for redevelopment?
In other words, in the other one, I think we were looking at, there was a factor that looked at that. Is there a factor in one of these three?
Yes, so basically the study area, how it's analyzed is by census block groups.
Yeah.
So we would be able to, I mean, that's how.
No, but I mean, you looked at transit access to employment, affordable housing vulnerability, and development pressure?
Yes.
So is it the development pressure that would account for the availability of land for housing?
Yes.
Affordable housing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really what I was trying to get at, is make sure that was a factor. Okay.
Okay, so essentially what you end up with from this.
Do you have a question, Pia?
Yeah. So as we're looking at the pressure there on Martin Luther King, and it seems like there's hardly any pressure. So your recommendation is to go out there and try to buy as much land for land banking, and so that we could preserve that.
So the MLK extends all the way to the FM 969, so it's way east. So this is what the overall kind of characteristics and environment that you can see the different indicators, how they play together. So potentially if there's lower development pressure there, it might be an indication that the land value is lower there. So again, this gives you kind of an overall that you can then go deeper and to make sure that is what's actually happening, and could potentially be a driver for a tool that could potentially be land banking. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we should mention this. The geographies we used here were the funded and preliminary corridors from the mobility bond.
Yes.
So this is not like all of MLK. This is the portion that is being funded by the mobility bond.
Yes.
Okay.
And we have the map. It's also kind of
It's a little small to
yeah.
read on the
yeah.
screen, unfortunately, but it's on there.
Do you have another question, Anne?
Well, just so this is, okay, I got it. There's overlap, but I think we raised this in the mobility committee, that it's not the Project Connect corridors. And so maybe that's a future step to look at the Project Connect corridors. Most of them are overlap, but there may be a few that aren't. So.
Yeah, to add in mobility bonds with Project Connect. I think that could be helpful.
Yep. So essentially, we took after this analysis with the tool was complete, we took these numbers that you see, these sort of index values that you get from the corridor housing preservation tool, and in order to create numerical sort of production and preservation goals out of those, we first used the Imagine Austin sort of centers and corridors as a benchmark. So essentially, the strategic housing blueprint sets a specific goal in terms of producing 75% of your units within a half mile of those Imagine Austin centers and corridors. We found that these mobility bond corridors represent about 31% of the sort of total Imagine Austin center and corridor areas, and so we just use that to say, okay, so we're going to take 75% of the 60,000, right? Because 75% within that Imagine Austin area, and then we'll take 31% of that and assign it to these corridors and say this is where that amount of housing should go. And then we use the index values that you see from Marla's analysis to actually define production and preservation goals for each corridor based on sort of that metric. And we added those up, and so the final numbers that you see in the corridor goals come from that source in terms of being, as Councilmember Kitchen said, kind of a component of those. They are also a sort of subcomponent of that 60,000 goal that overlaps with the council district goals. And as Marla mentioned, right, so production goals were defined by prioritizing areas that had lower development pressure. So I think this answers sort of Councilmember Kitchen's question to an extent, that those are areas where it's easier to access land, versus preservation goals being prioritized in areas with high development pressure where we know the risk of displacement is high. And with that, I have a questions and comments slide.
Questions? Natasha?
One question, but it's going to require that I go back several slides.
Sure.
To the council district goals, page 11.
Okay.
I guess it. Oh,
Bless.
bless you. Goodness. Sorry. A lot like Miss Rosie. I can't see. I can't see this presentation.
I'm sorry.
And it's okay. Yeah, my friends are going to make fun of me too. I do have some questions though here. So while I understand the thought process here, I keep thinking if essentially what the goal is to equitably disperse affordable housing options, but we're simultaneously addressing displacement. And so frequently the discussions around displacement are around like right to return, right to stay. But essentially we're still going to exacerbate displacement by sending people who otherwise would have preferred to stay in or return to certain districts to, the higher opportunity dispersion districts. Do you understand where I'm getting at, basically?
I do,
Okay.
yeah. And I think this is a question that, especially when you come to like sort of the fair housing conversation that really says like, okay, well, we want high opportunity areas. And you're like, well, what about reinvesting in the areas we have where people have built community? And I think this really does attempt to sort of get at things that do both, right? So we added gentrifying areas as a number specifically because we had heard in sort of our previous iteration of this that there was not enough emphasis on reinvestment, right? So the gentrifying areas, the Imagine Austin high frequency transit sort of come together to ensure that every council district has a degree of investment. I do think though that we have here prioritized new investment. One other contextual point is that the 60,000 number can be production or preservation investment. So it could also go toward preserving units that might otherwise, say, expire if their compliance period for federal dollars, for example, has come to an end, to repurchase those, say, low-income housing tax credit properties and say, we're going to keep those affordable and renovate them and make them great for another 30 years. That could certainly be a component of this. So I wouldn't want it to seem like this is the only potential here is to just do new construction in areas where people currently are not living. I think it is very important that we have that opportunity.
Thank you for that clarification. It helps.
Could you tell me a bit about, on slide 19, how intense is the development pressure? It talks about percentage of multifamily land area predicted to redevelop in the next 5 years. Can you tell me where you get that information from and how you predict that?
Yeah, that is part of a tool, a mapping tool. It's called Envision Tomorrow,
Okay.
and it's one of the tools that they have in that platform, that toolkit. So it basically looks into a few variables, but the most prominent ones are the year that the building was built, and also the land value. So basically, as there's some assumptions there, basically saying that when the land value is just higher than kind of the time that the building was built, it's probably going to be ripe for redevelopment and in a 5 to 10 years, etc. So they have like different categories. So that's one of the calculations in the software that we used.
Does it factor in market rate if it's keeping up with the increase in rents, or?
So it doesn't. That particular tool doesn't, but we added to that the value of redevelopment permits that are happening in that specific area to kind of compensate for that. So not having that in the tool, but we kind of added that. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Do we have any more questions? All right. Did you have, I see a couple more slides in here. Did you?
Those were just as background in case we needed them. They were responses to some of the questions that we had received, I think, from different council offices over time, and that we had shared, I think, in written form previously, but we wanted to just have here in case. And then also some background slides on different parts of the process. But I think they are not necessary unless we have a question about any of them.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate that. I like extra backup.
Yeah.
If there are no more further questions on this item, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.